Actually,
you want to say something?
no, actually this painting was the last of the series that I did, and I noticed it got much more looser. The one that Alan, my partner, is standing in front of, I did first, and then I started moving around. He's like, oh. Yeah. And it's called Let's Walk to the Middle of the Ocean. And I think by the time I got to this, it was really about the collision of things. I think in some ways it was about the kind of social things that I was thinking of, probably around the early AIDS epidemic and also the history of abstraction. You know, it's interesting being an abstract painter and really peeling back like 1950s abstraction and kind of what was in it and what wasn't in it. And kind of thinking like, MoMA, 1950s, and the creation of abstract expressionism that came all over the world, but at the same time it was the rise of civil rights too. And going back and being an abstract painter and kind of thinking, going between the two, loving art history and and thinking about the body, the black male body, and so by the time I got to that, it was like the colliding of two worlds, and yeah. And I know it's also something, it's loose. This is much more gestural and loose. It's more tight there, and it seems like, I tend to do that sometimes. Sometimes I'll contain myself, believe it or not. Believe it or not. And then sometimes as I work, it just gets freer, looser. This actually feels very gestural, the painting to the left. It feels very gestural in some ways.
It seems that, Mark, you have always been convinced about the possibility of painting.
Yes.
So you've critiqued the history of painting, as you just said. You sort of look at the history of abstraction, and you think about what was in it, but also what wasn't in it. But you always seem to have faith that painting can say all the things you want to say as an artist. Why?
Well, I think that painting, I think that my interest in the 2D work, and I don't like people to tell me I can't do something. It's, oh, you shouldn't do painting. Oh, you don't do that, you'll never. I just don't like that. I never have liked that. I've always determined my own course. And I thought, well, that's one viewpoint. It's one way of looking at it. And then I became really interested in, okay, let's start with materials. Let's start with something that already resonates with something. And I thought, well, if I use something other than pigment, which has this really a lot of luggage and baggage, what if I use something that is a little more common, the material's a little bit more common? So thinking about paper and liquefying it and determining or I'm going to make this look like, I think it was just my infinite belief that I can will something into existence. I've always been that way. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. So I've never listened too much to people. People don't bring me down too much. Well, that's your opinion. Let me go on over here and find something. So I heard all the talk about why I shouldn't do what I do. I got that. I got that in 6th grade walking across the schoolyard. I got that. But I was just determined to find a way in. On my terms. Yeah.
Right. So what is it that you were putting into these works? What are you adding to this dialogue of art history in your painting specifically?
But you know, I don't think the painting always has to, I think it's well, I would even think that, I think in some ways they sanitize the history of abstract painters in some ways. I mean, we don't know if they were political or not political. It was the 1950s and 60s, surely there was some relationship to it. I don't think you always have to have a gaze inward. I just turned my gaze outward and found the materials of the world in which I live in. I think it's the only thing what am I going to do? Look inside and sort of the whole idea of channeling something? This kind of, I'm channeling the inner dark, that's inherently racist to me. So what am I going to, I'm already dark, so I'm channeling the inner Scandinavian or something. I mean, it falls apart, right? This kind of channeling of something, this kind of emotive, you know, so I just thought, I looked out at the world and tried to find, through abstraction, I found a lot of freedom, even around social things. You don't carry a lot of baggage, but there's a kind of an over-determining of the black body sometimes in the media. We know what it looks like, we know what it sounds like, and if you don't, just look on YouTube. So I just thought, God, an all urban environment, an all black environment, and wanting to abstract it, is that an oxymoron? Is that something that doesn't dialectically go together? And I just didn't believe that it did.
And was that fed by your deep belief in understanding the role that place, particularly LA, would have in your work? Your need to abstract that relationship? Because let's go back to the beginning. Mark, when did you know you were an artist?
Oh, when did I know? Well, I didn't know I was an artist probably until maybe I started going to art schools. But I knew that I was always making things, and I knew that I was different. Not because I thought that I was different, but the community let me know real early, you're different. So I got that memo really quick. I mean, it was special delivery, boom. So I knew that there was something a little off, because in the cafeteria, it was like, don't sit here. So I got that one. So I thought, okay, there's this kind of external board that has told me, isolated me. I didn't isolate them, they isolated me. So I thought, all right, so in my isolation, I was able to wander. I was free because I didn't have to live up to the code, because I wasn't part of the code. I'd already sinned. So in that kind of sin, I just kind of wandered, and I was free, and I always did things. I did whatever I wanted to do, whenever I wanted to do it. And nobody was looking. I didn't have anything to prove. My batting average was pretty low. So I was actually probably more free, but I was also very isolated and condemned. Like, I knew when I was on the street and they pointed, oh, there's that one. I knew, run! I knew what that was. I actually became a fast runner. Like, I was a very good, I learned how to run really fast. So, but I was free. I was free, and I didn't have anything to prove because I had already been deemed a certain thing. And let me be clear. What I'm talking about has nothing to do with gayness or homosexuality. It has to do with sissy. And sissy is not gendered, and sissy has to do with sexuality. Sissy is this nebulous thing that floats. And all it says is, if we tag you as that, there's something a little bit off about you.
It's an othering.
It's an othering. There you go. It's an othering. So I got othered real early. And that's a little sissy. That's sissy. That's kind of sissy. Or like a girl, she's kind of mannish. I was like, what's that mean by mannish? So this kind of othering for me was great because
it opened it up.
Opened up everything.
So when you got to art school, though, right? So you're at Cal Arts, and you're in the midst of this kind of environment where you are being thought about, right, as an artist, right?
Yeah.
You're in art
As a
school.
black artist.
As a black artist. Yeah. And this was late 80s.
No.
Early 90s.
Early 90s,
Early
yeah.
90s. What then did you begin to think you would make as an artist?
Well, I got to Cal Arts and it was really about identity at the same time, and they were asking me about the black experience, and I was like, well, I don't know, the black experience and how do you feel? It's too many big narratives, meta-narratives, and so I did a lot of experimenting. I did a lot of photography, a lot of performance, a lot of reading, a lot of writing. I didn't really go back to painting until I was in grad school.
Right.
Because I didn't want to defend my practice. I don't defend me, I don't defend. I got, so early on, I stopped defending who I was. I certainly wasn't going to get in school and defend myself. I was like 35 years old. So, and then I knew I was going to go back to painting. I was going to find some way to have a conversation with that, and I did.
And I think that's important to say, because we talk about this often, that, you had a break.
I had a pause.
You had a pause, right, in between your undergraduate life and going to grad school and really beginning to practice as an artist, right? So you were back beginning to make work at 35. You were fully an adult.
Yeah, I mean,
lived?
between 20 and let's see, 18. I got a PhD in nightclubs.
Right.
Yeah, but I did really good though. I mean, baby, you know, I can. You see about the little video.
Yeah, right.
Right. But here's the thing though. What I believe is, and this is something I've had to think about a couple times, is when you're 15 years old, you are supposed to be, you know, you study for SATs and everything, and you move through the narrative, and you go to schools and everything. Well, when I was 18 years old, I think that since I didn't do that, I just went to the streets and all the costumes and all this. I think that was my kind of performance. I used the nightclubs to kind of use as my kind of, and me and my friends, we used that as a way to perform and to express ourselves. So I don't think it was like, oh, I was a performance artist, but I know that all the intensity we put into the costumes. Thank God there was no cell phones back then, but you know, just all of that. But the focus, I'm sure came from the same place, same kind of a.
So you came back to making art.
I did, yeah. I'd say formalized, yeah.
Formalized, and came back to painting.
Yeah.
And that choice occurred to you how? Really, because I'm trying to get to how we get here.
How we got here?
Because there's such an amazing way it seems that it happened for you.
Well, the big R, gender and race and class, they were all coming at me pretty strong. They're like, Mark, you could have an identity career. You could have this career. You could have this. Just speak out of this voice and speak out of this. Oh, especially if your student's going to be in South Central. Oh, we can really. And I thought, you know what? I need peace and quiet, and I need a place that's quiet that I can figure all this out. And for me, it was abstraction. So abstraction gave me the freedom to play. You know, often you don't see enough, and it's only because of the media determines it this way. You don't see enough black bodies that are just vulnerable and silly and messy and crying. They like us a certain way in the media. The men are hard, and we have a certain thing. And so I was just thinking, you know what, I want a space where I can play and be vulnerable and not know and question things in the shadows. In the shadows of the big narratives. Because every time something happens in the news, people look at me, well, how do you feel? I said, well, I don't know, then give me a minute. Like, I kind of need a minute. So I needed a minute to process, and so in the shadows. So to me, it's like the body is removed and it stays in the shadow. And what you see are these little details, the things that I'm kind of working out. I kind of exist in kind of like, my body exists in the shadows. And it's so funny, I'm sitting here looking like a praying mantis all my long legs and stuff, but it's funny because my body is so exaggerated. And to have something that I want to like, but I constantly want to be in the shadows, is kind of a strange paradox.
Exactly, because it's very hard for you to be
hard to miss. I mean, I was over there like, yes.
Right, very hard.
And when people go into restaurants, did the tall black guy walk in?
Yeah, right.
Where's the tall, skinny black guy? Yeah. Oh, he's at that table. Yeah.
But it seems you're conscious of, this is such an aside, but I remember when we first met, how you shrunk down so that we could like have a conversation. No, it's true. He did. Like Mark literally kept coming
Sat down and,
because there was such
girl,
a distance.
please put me in that show. I'm so tired of pressing hair, I don't know what to do.
So much has been made of the origin myth of our meeting in that regard. But I do remember that you sat me in the chair, but you sat down so that
on the stool.
On the stool,
yeah.
so that we could be at the same height.
I really wasn't even there. I was just looking at you like, this is Thelma Golden. She's in my hair salon, girl, what? Oh, and you had some little leopard mules. I do remember some.
Why do you remember that always about that?
They were just leopard little mules. I just remember.
For clarity, so this is an important point because I began working at the Studio Museum in 2000 and was very unclear about what kind of show as a curator I was going to make, and sort of set out on this little listening tour, studio tour, to look at young artists because I'd had this amazing advantage of working with an amazing generation of artists in the 90s, but sort of thought, okay, I want to do something different. And Danny Martinez told me to go see Mark. And everyone knows about me, I'm looking at Eileen here, I don't drive on the freeway in LA. I don't. 25 years ago in LA, I don't drive on the freeway, I drive on the streets. So I drove all the way from the west side.
You did, and I was like, why is she on the streets?
While I'm on the streets, drove all the way. I went, Wilshire, Western, I had my little way to get there and got to Mark's salon. And everyone had told me I was going to a salon, but I don't know. I thought that was maybe like ironic.
No,
but I got there. No, really. I was like, why are they all telling me to go to the salon? And I get to the salon, and literally, Mark had someone in his chair.
That's what I said, girl, get up.
Yeah, there was a woman in his chair.
For real.
And I was mortified. I was like, Mark made her move.
No, it's all right, girl. She'll be all right. I'll do her roots for free. She'll be all right. Take a little bit off that bill. She'll be all right.
And he made me sit down in the chair, which made me higher, and then he got lower. And I remember having that first conversation and being so conscious of how you existed in space from that moment. But more importantly than that was then we left the salon. So I don't know what happened to her and her hair that day.
I'll hook her up later.
Because Mark then invited me to his studio, and we walked outside, and we walked around the corner, and you took your key out, and we went into your studio, and it was filled with paintings.
Yeah.
I remember that to this day. It was completely, you had a fully realized body of work in that studio that you'd been working on in this quiet space that you'd created for yourself without necessarily having reaction or engagement around it. Like you formed that sense of what your aesthetic was going to be in the space of not just that studio, but in the world that you'd created in the neighborhood itself, right? That you were doing that. And it feels like you've continued, right? The work has continued to come from that place, the one that you create, as opposed to one that's created by the art world, the culture world. Though those of us who are lucky enough to come into it and work with you can bring it. What is it? Tell me. Mike, what is it about this idea of space?
Isolation.
Well, and the spaces that you operate and exist in that then get echoed in these works.
It's interesting. I think I navigate between a lot of different psychological spaces. I do. I think that I just kind of open it's like a room, and there's all kinds of things in there, and I'm just really interested in them. I'm not or curious about them. And I think I've always had, as far as architecture itself, I've always had a real strong relation to architecture just because of my body. I'm always aware of seating and heights and breadth and I can't put my hands out there. So I'm always aware of architecture, and I think I've always been that way. I just looking at space and the way people move through space and people occupy space and the way work looks in space. I think I've always been, as a kid, interested in that.
Yeah, and what that does to the work itself.
It's funny, I don't hang my own artwork. I don't hang my work. It's funny. I can do the work, but once it gets here, it's kind of somebody else's house. I like to see what they're going to do with it. And I was like, oh, I never would have thought about that. So it's kind of a relationship, a trust. I trust them to do their job, and they trust me to do my job.
And to create some different context for it.
Yeah, because I wouldn't have thought to put that painting next to that painting, because when I was working on it in my studio, I got very fixed on certain things, so kind of opening it, it's kind of like with hair. Somebody will come into the hair salon, and they just know how their hair should look. But you want to tell them, that's kind of old school, and it doesn't look that good on you, makes you really... But they just know, this is the way I've always worn this color. And you're like, yeah, but it's just, if you just let me do my job, I could hook you up and make you look cuter, but you're so fixed. So, I don't know why that came up, Because you're always moving with the hair, but and I don't know where that came from, but the idea that so for new relationships, so when I come in with the work, I don't want what I can do. I want to see other relationships happen, and Mark and Tate, who so brilliantly put this whole show together with also the people who work at the gallery. It surprised me.
Exactly. What surprised you? What about, I remember seeing some of these works in process in the studio this summer, and now seeing them fully realized here, amazing. But tell me what surprises you in seeing these. I mean, there are so many things happening here, Mark, that look like you are moving somewhere. What have you been thinking? I mean, the looseness you've already talked about, but it seems to me also color.
There's a lot more color.
Is operating very differently for you. It seems the way in which you're treating the surfaces. And I know surface has always been important, and it's always been a very sort of important part of your process to speak about these issues that are in the work, but the surfaces here seem different. What's happening?
I'm just trying to keep it interesting for me. I'm always pushing me. I'm always thinking about how to expand what I do. So when I first started to think about space, I was really thinking about beauty and horror at the same time, because a lot of the stuff that I was talking about in the show I felt was kind of dark. But I'm not a dark person at all. Well, I am dark, but I'm not, my soul is not dark. So there's light and dark, and I thought, well, so I was playing with both of those, and I thought how in which things can float in space, and these kind of nodules, these kind of surfaces, these kind of warts or sarcoma or lesions, I started to kind of use those as a base, but then they become marks or tabs or impressions, and they kind of expand more than that. So that kind of opened up a new way of working, just because the surface was so raised. And I wanted to find new ways to make a line, so cutting, actually physically cutting the surface, was just another extension of my, trying to extend my vocabulary. I use colors that are very loaded. Pink is a very loaded color. And I use colors actually I wasn't comfortable with. I'm not really comfortable with a whole lot of color. I actually don't like color in my work that much, so I really pushed to see if I was comfortable with that. The informalness of the Waterfall piece and thinking about what constitutes a painting, the flatness of it here almost feels like a painting, but then you look and it has this density. So really, and it has a relationship to it needs the architecture to exist, so I feel like that was something I was interested in playing with. Scale. I was making all these large paintings, and I was like, okay, Mark, now, don't turn this into religion. And so then I went really small, just to give myself flexibility. I'm always looking, I don't ever want anything to become written in stone. And so I made the small works in the back, and the videos kind of bookmark the.
So I want to talk about both Waterfall and the video. So let's start with Waterfall. And I know this is a pre-preview, so everyone might not have seen it yet, but let's talk about it, but with the hope that everyone will see it. What made that? I mean, when I first saw that, what I thought about was its relationship always to the idea of tearing, ripping in your work. But how did you come to think about, as you say, a painting that kind of dematerializes?
Well, the sort of erasure or dematerial, that word I can never say. It actually came from, it was a trace or the reference of another work that I was doing on the wall. And it was almost like a performance, this kind of wall piece, and then you would pull everything off. And I thought, the performative part is me pulling everything off, which I would never show, but what's left is this trace on the wall. And I started looking at those pieces on the ground, and I thought, And I'm sure I remember just like flinging it, flinging it, and it laid on something, and sometimes I think I saw something. And I did say this earlier, all the time I don't have, so how I work, this increments, taking small bits that build into a whole, this confidence of, when you start with one dot, that eventually it's going to be a whole painting. Black hair is very much the same way. You start curl at a time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you curl, and at the end you pull it all together. This kind of building up something in increments, small increments to a whole, is something I'm super comfortable with. I don't know if it came from my 20 years doing that, and it's just something I'm comfortable with. I don't know. But this accumulation of small cells that make a whole is something that I'm just completely comfortable with. because halfway through it, you can lose faith, oh, it's not going to work, but you just have to keep building it up. So I just kept tearing them off the wall and laying them over, and then I started looking at different color palettes and lights and darks, and really started creating a painting. And I said, oh, I'm just creating a painting. Once that started to happen, it just kind of unfolded and unfolded. I like the informalness of it. I used to do canvases that just would hang on the wall a long time ago. You remember just, enter a neck, I said, then it has no, yeah. Sort of just tacked to the wall. So I like that informalness. The vulnerability of it is something that I quite like in that piece itself.
All right, so we're going to talk about Spider-Man.
Uh-oh.
So, as you know, I came out to LA a month or so ago. Took like a super early flight, 6 in the morning, got off the plane, went to the Hammer, and walked into the video. 10 in the morning.
It woke you up?
It woke me up, no, definitely. And what was so amazing to me was the idea that you had described it, as you always do, in its broadest terms. Right? That you were going to think about stand-up and comedy in relation to both your work, the ideas in your work, and the world at large. Describe the piece.
It's one of those, Red Fox's Party Records, old Red Fox party records, or Richard Pryor's The Black Album, or something. It just, was it The Black Album? It was one of those albums, I can't remember. Taboo, stand-up, bad, Moms, Mabley, bad, shouldn't be listening to it, and then after midnight you listen to it. So that texture I kind of wanted to do, but I also wanted to really fill it with very strong content of things that I was interested in. The AIDS epidemic and how we privilege certain groups of people sort of over other people, and the idea of you can't breathe, the guy in the subway couldn't breathe and actually died. So I knew that I wanted to have a lot of content, but I didn't know how I was going to do it. And I use comedy because I find that comedy is a way in. I think sometimes it can be a little mean and one-dimensional, especially when the gaze always is at the woman or at the weaker in the pack. So I find like, okay, enough of that already. But there's a long tradition of comedy, and I wasn't so. And I remembered I had cared less about Eddie Murphy and his stand-up, but I was fascinated when the Delirious, and he came out on stage and he said, no faggots, and everybody said, "Wah!" So that means that this kind of gay bashing entered into the public. It was fine. It entered into pop culture. A few years later, Bitch and Ho, this kind of aggressive deconstructing in popular culture of the black female, right? So almost now it's a caricature, right? Oh no, that's... So I'm always fascinated at that moment when it enters into it's okay. It's just popular culture, it's totally fine. We're having all these debates now about the N-word because it's so much part of popular culture. And how do we reel that fish back in on the line? So I'm always fascinated, and I was just fascinated. I said, oh, and so I remember that moment, and the piece kind of came out of it. It's like Spider-Man it's like Mark is in the shadows, kind of implicating out this way.
How did you make the video?
Crazy. Crazy. I made an Eddie Murphy. I made the red jumpsuit and the medallions, and I'd walk around the studio talking like that all day. I told Alan, I said, well, I'm going to perform it. He said, no, you are not. You want that to be on YouTube for the rest of your life? Sometimes I think of ideas and you got to run them by somebody to go, Mark, that's not a good idea. That is not a good idea. But then I thought, the language and the sound implicates us because in popular culture, the stereotypes exist there. So you don't need the body for the body to be there because it's been over-determined. The black body has been so over-determined in popular culture, it doesn't need to be there for it to be there.
Just have the text, right?
Just have the text. So, she talks black. I'm like, okay, can you explain to me exactly what that means? So it's just, and it came out of that. It came out of probably, probably a little rage. A little rage,
Well, there's a lot of anger in the humor.
A lot of anger in the humor. And humor can be a little angry, I think, that's okay.
And you wrote the text.
I did write the text.
Consecutively, or were you responding to things?
No, I wrote it, and actually Alan was the one that helped me with the one-liners, because he's kind of funny in stand-up, believe it or not. And so he would say, no, that you need, this timing is good. He had me look at old, Joan Rivers and people that. So, but I wrote the text. It came fairly easy. I probably wrote 5 pages of dialogue down to 5 minutes, and there were moments when I was very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable.
When?
Almost all of it. And really, I thought it's one thing to play it for your friends, like, oh, ha, 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 ha. Okay, Mark, I said, I'm gonna show this where? Where are you gonna show this? That's a different thing. So I was a little, but I realized that it was this idea at the time of, early kind of AIDS was so connected to the church in the PRing of it. It went biblical really fast. And this idea of condemnation and being condemned was really something that I really took on when I was 18 years old. And I think if you're, you begin to act it out. You think I'm bad, I'm gonna really be bad. So I think a lot of it, that kind of idea, or the ideas came out of that youthful living or feeling condemned and running haunted around the world. And mapping, if you even look at the mapping in my work, I spent so much time traveling the world in my 20s. So it's interesting. But you just put it in the work, because there's lightness in me too. There's lightness and joy and joking as well. So it's not just all dark. But I don't mind looking at things that are a little more troubling. You can't, or I can't. I have no interest in just not looking at them.
But it seems that there's also a commitment to abstraction in that as well.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You sort of created a deeply, and in a way, having both videos in this exhibition provides a counterpoint to think about the way that your work has always involved these other practices, right? As a way to unpack, what's interesting and inspiring.
Well, you just said it, unpacking it. It's the same thing. It's like I'm really interested in the history of abstraction, and I see so few sort of African American men. They've been mining the territory. It's just that the way in which it was built or constructed, we have to just but what the good thing about it is we're always rethinking history and making addendums, as we should, just like with the Bill of Rights and the addendums, and we should be able to say we've left people out or we need to make an addendum. So I don't think that that's a bad thing. I just think that we should agree that we need to make concessions for certain things and certain people that we're not part of a larger conversation. And so I love doing what I do, and I love all the kind of different things that I move in and out of. I don't know which one I like more or less.
Well, seeing all this, because you've been working hard on this exhibition for many months, what's next? What are you thinking about in the work next?
Oh, what's next? What's next? Girl, I just go back to the studio and turn on the lights. I don't, and it's right there. It's usually, I have some probably shows that I'm going to do, but I always take off from the last painting or the last video or the last sculpture. It's always I just start the next one. Yeah, I'm not, it's funny, I look like like at the tortoise and the hare, I actually look like I'm the hare, but actually I'm more like the tortoise. I'm just like one, after another, very I'm really I'm not at all the hare. actually. I look like, yeah, no, I don't. I'm just, I think if you took every painting from the very beginning of my career all the way to there, you could say, yeah, there he changed the colors, and then he did that. It wouldn't be a very, just I get to where I need to go very slowly.
Wow. But it seems that the path you take to get there very slowly opens up lots of possibilities.
Yeah.
Because if we look at each of these bodies of work, you sort of, in each case, stretched out
Unpack it.
in really fantastic, interesting ways. Do you want to take some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Would anyone like to ask Mark any questions? Because I could keep talking to Mark forever. Yes.
I'm like, this is individually when you're constructing work. When you say, like, when you're doing something in pairs, an analogy, and in the middle of it, where you're making the curls, like maybe you're about losing faith and you know you just have to continue. When you're doing that, do you have like an end vision of like, I know what it's going to be? Or is it just like, I'm just going to focus on the process, just focus on each one, and I know somehow at the end it's going to work out?
She said she was fascinated by the idea of building up a canvas incrementally at a time, small pieces, and in the middle. And in the beginning of it, you lose faith, and like, right, that's basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And keep going. I always lose faith somewhere along the line in a work. That just happens. The work falls apart. That's just going to happen. It just does. If it doesn't fall apart, I don't think it's probably very good. But what I do know how to do really well is keep going. I always say, well, Mark, just keep going. Come, push through the bad day, and maybe tomorrow's going to be the good day. So I do know how to show up. And sometimes I'll work on more than one thing. If it gets just too bad on one painting, I'll skip to one that's a little friendlier. And I kind of go back to the mean one, So I have a lot of little tricks and strategies, and sometimes I'll just cover up all of the painting but the small part that I'm working on, because the other part it's just not working out. And also another thing which I like to say is you got to protect, or I need to protect, that vulnerable kind of sensitivity that I have being an artist. That's probably why I don't say, oh, guess what I'm working on too much to too many people, because if they say, well, Mark, that's completely crazy. Why would you do something like that? That's crazy. So I always try to protect that, or to get a little more confidence. So it's always about protecting that vulnerable little that childlike spirit that can play. But I have bad days,
But you're very generous with yourself in the studio a lot, because even...
I tell my business a lot.
Well, you are always willing to kind of look at work and see it as a process.
Yes.
As opposed to, it's finished, it's not, right? You sort of live with the work in ways that you allow it to tell you things, and you spend a lot of time thinking about it as you're making it, because it's often how you describe work in
Sure.
process. Right?
Yeah, I know when a work is done, but I will sometimes work halfway through it and stop for 6 months, or put it away if the nerves get too bad, and I'll put it away. And it's all about just knowing the gauge and the temperature.
Other question? Yes, Bernard.
Mark, what I love so much about your story is that you, an artist, from where you came from.
Very privileged background. Why's everybody
You
laughing?
could have gone even more privileged. You could have, I guess, quote unquote, left your roots and never looked back and set up your shop and your new life somewhere else.
Yeah.
But instead, you not only stayed where you came from, but
Yeah.
you invested seriously where you came from. You're continuing to do that with art.
Yeah.
Was that something, and this is thinking of other artists who might have the opportunity to do that, or might not think that they shouldn't do that, and might consider it? Do you feel that that's something that came from within? Was it something that you felt someone sort of like led you to that? And do you think how has that impacted your sense of yourself as an artist, aside from the work you make, but also your role and the other things that an artist can do?
Whoa. It's funny though. I never left, really. I always was. I never left. I added things. But here, I grew up. I never left. I never left. Another thing that when people say staying, even when I was in a kind of local community, and if we were all the same color, I was always still an outsider. I was always still an artist. I never was a traditionalist. I never was. Even when if the whole room was still all the same color, I was always different. So difference isn't just because of one's a different color. There's a huge plurality just in kind of black life, where there's kind of non-traditional, traditional, all kind of cohabiting. So I always was different. And my mom was kind of a hippie, and we didn't go to church. I knew. So I stayed as this kind of non-traditional person because I always was. And when I started adding and I started having a foundation and I started bringing in other non-traditional people and liberal people, just, the same thing, it really wasn't that different. I just kind of opened it wider, cast a larger net. Just what happens so much in the telling of the black story a lot of times in the media, it's like they give you 3 channels, like ABC, NBC, and HBO. They don't give you like 45 different channels. So people become accustomed to only seeing 3 channels of the narrative, and it's a huge narrative. So for me, I always was there as a weirdo, called good stuff and bad stuff. So that never really changed. And it never changed. It hasn't changed this very day. It's always been the same.
It's just expanded into what now is
Yeah,
not only your art practice, but art and practice.
Yeah,
the
art and
foundation
practice, yeah.
with Alan DeCastro and Eileen Harris Norton, and the work that you all are doing to think about ways that you can be in the community that you have stayed in and that
Yes.
you've committed to, and to do it in ways that kind of open up more possibilities for more people like you and the community at large.
Yeah, well, on the art side, I love what we do. I think these conversations are great. It would be great if it could be in a local neighborhood. So then we're always asking the people to come to the mountain, go out of your communities, drive on the bus, and feel really uncomfortable in the temple of art. Well, if it was just in the neighborhood, contemporary, full, expansive ideas, little a instead of big A, we would probably find more practitioners earlier that thought, I get this. I can own this too. It can belong to me too. I get this. So I just wanted to have the contemporary art space of art and practice on the way. It's like on the way to the liquor store, right around the corner from what's the liquor store and what's next to it? Pizza place and just local businesses. There's this contemporary art space showing what we do. And they can go in there and they can have a relationship with something that is local, but I think that's a great thing. I think that's because I believe in what we do. I love what we do. I discovered a lot of passion for this. And I make it accessible. Don't change anything. Just make it accessible. And also, I wanted to work with something outside of the art world, so I work with foster youth because it's so epidemic in that area that I live in. So I thought, well, this is happening immediately outside of the doors, and I want to kind of engage both. So I just kind of put them together. Yeah, the hand went up in the back.
One more question.
Did you have mentors as you were developing early as an artist?
Did I have mentors? Yeah, I did. I did have mentors. I had friends and people that I listened to. Yeah, absolutely. People that I respected. Still do. I still do. The guy in the back, the way you were just so intent, that hand just shot up so.
It just happened, I just happened to actually be maybe a mile away from art practice in America.
Oh yeah.
And I'm just kind of wondering, what's your position right now? Is it an experiment that's been bearing fruit? Every time I pass by the building, I can't help but have this feeling that it's almost something that was kind of uprooted somewhere, just planted in the neighborhood. And because I lived in the neighborhood for 10 years, and I always wondered, because we've been waiting for that in the neighborhood for a long time. And and I was really happy to see it. And I'm just wondering, do you feel like there is an integration between this project and the neighborhood?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's the neighborhood has a long history of music. Leimert Park has a long history of music. It actually started with a lot of visual arts and contemporary artists, but that history kind of went underground in the 80s and 90s, more the history that we understand about Leimert Park is music. So for me, I really looked at like, well, as a visual artist, I wanted to kind of spotlight the visual artists because they had kind of gotten pushed to the side a little bit, and music is what we understand about Leimert Park. Lots of great, we have World Stage, Barbara Morris, we have a lot of places, but nothing that shows contemporary art. So for me, that was just the first thing, is to create a space that was just for contemporary art. And that hadn't been there in not many spaces south of the 10 freeway. So it did just, a contemporary space did appear, but it was tapping into the Brockman Gallery, the only African-American art gallery, was from 1969 to I think that 1983, had disappeared off of the map. So there was no place for contemporary artists to go, to show their work, to have this relationship. And so I thought I wanted to kind of reacquaint Leimert Park back with the contemporary art part of it. Yeah.
When did you discover that your difference was actually a strength?
I'm sorry?
Sorry. When did you discover that your difference was actually a strength? You called yourself a sissy.
No, I didn't call myself a sissy. Everybody else called me that. When did it was a strength? I think anything eventually, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. I mean, and on that note,